Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes, or Liberty Lass, our level 43 character, who has a 1.76 million experience to go to get to level 44 at 25 million influence. And we're on a story arc for Jenny Firkins, which we will continue. And today we're going to talk also as we go about um, not only gaming, but publishing, movie creation, television shows, comic books, creative industries, and why it seems game developers. It seems like all of these industries with creative output aren't being very creative, and they're producing a lot of recycled content and a lot of bad content. We're going to talk about that, but first, I want to apologize. The last couple of episodes, I don't think the sound has been coming through. I heard it on my headphones, but the audio was not being piped into OBS from the headphones for some bizarre reason. I don't know why, because I'm pretty sure, unless it was that I don't think so, unless I did these after my Deadlands game where I switched up to my Yeti external, my Yeti microphone instead of my headphone. I don't know what happened. I usually check it after that, but I don't remember if I checked it. Anyway, I do apologize if that there was no sort of background sound of the game. Hopefully now you'll be able to hear it when we get into combat a little bit, right? You don't. I keep it low, but hopefully you'll hear it at least a little bit of the sound effects. And if not, let me know in the comments, and I'll try to fix it again. It looks on OBS like it's working, but one of the problems I have is I only have one monitor, and so I can't have OBS up while I'm doing stuff in the game. So what I do is, like right now, I tab out of it, I look, and there's like a little dot on the OBS audio scale that shows that there has been some sound, but it doesn't show anything currently because whenever I switch to OBS, it sort of turns COH into a background app, and the sound does not come through on OBS at that point, right? On my computer at all. So anyway, I do apologize for that. Um, what I want to do now is talk a little bit about creativity and why we perhaps seen some of the patterns we've discussed in our rants. And whoops, and this is probably going to repeat a little bit with something I ranted about when I was doing the American Truck Simulator, but most people from this channel didn't watch that, so I guess it won't be a repeat unless you happen to watch that. And I'm not going to say the exact same things, but it's a very parallel concept. So I was actually watching. I've been watching stuff about writing because I've been doing some writing, and also stuff about reading, book recommendations and stuff like that, because I've been doing a lot of reading and always looking for new books. And I was doing some research on lit RPG and that sort of thing. By the way, I've ordered through Amazon like 4 or 5 lit RPG books, and I couldn't get the what was it, the Wandering Inn. Doesn't seem to have a physical copy, but I'm going to try to get that as an ebook. But I've got a couple of the other ones, including I can't remember which one. One of the ones somebody recommended in the comments, they had print on demand paperback, and I got it from Amazon. They're pretty inexpensive, the lit RPG ones, so I got like 4 of them. Mostly because I don't know which one. They're all series, so like, oh man, I don't want to get in the middle of 4 series and try to. But I don't know which one, if any, I'm gonna like. So I just figured let me try a sampling of them, and we'll see how it goes. I just finished reading Brandon Sanderson's Warbreaker, which I liked, although he insists that he feels like Elantris is not his best book because it was his first published. I actually liked Elantris better than Warbreaker, um, and actually better than Mistborn. So far, of the books of his that I've read, my favorite is Elantris. Anyway, um, so it was somebody who was talking about writing and publishing, and the question was, are too many books being published? But as part of the discourse, what she said was that something is happening not just in publishing, although it is happening in publishing, and it was somebody who was formerly at a publishing house who mentioned this, and she showed the post where he like wrote about it. But then she said it's also happening, in the entertainment industry, TV companies. It's happening in, and I would say it's happening in gaming. It's happening in comic books. It's happening in movies. we're seeing this. I didn't mean to talk. I meant to hit this. We're seeing this a proliferation of stuff. Right? There's more books and movies and comics and stuff coming out than ever before, but they're not selling very well and they aren't very good. Right? And it almost seems like the whole system has broken down. The whatever mechanisms existed to filter out the bad content from the good and to ensure that what was, not that everything published was always great, but to ensure that um, things of quality kind of got in there. Again, always publishing houses and movie studios are a little risk averse. We've talked about being risk averse. They want to be careful. Some of these things can cost millions of dollars or even $1 billion to produce. So they want to be careful to make sure that they're not going to lose money. But you would think that that would make them more selective and that they'd be putting out better and better stuff if they're going to spend all this money on it. And yet, it doesn't seem to be working. It seems like whatever mechanisms existed in the past to cause there to be quality to come in, the cream rising to the top, doesn't seem to exist anymore. There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of copying. A lot more than there used to be. There's a lack of originality, and there's an awful lot of remaking of old stuff. And so, what this person was saying is the reason why is that these creative organizations, whether it was a publishing house that was producing creative writing, or whether it was a TV studio that was producing TV shows that were produced by creative writers and acted in by creative um, actors and directed by creative directors and stuff. All of these things that are creative activities. Comic books with the artist and the colorer and the letterer and the um, writer all working together to produce a new creative thing, right? The people running the organizations that fronted the money to produce the products had come up through the industry themselves before getting into these positions of power, right? So if you think about, and I'll use comic books because I'm more familiar with that process, partly because I read them for years and years and they were pretty transparent about what the process used to be when I was a kid, but also because I wanted to become a comic book writer. So I tried to learn everything I could about how to do that, and then by the time I grew up and was old enough to be a comic book writer, I stopped reading comics and didn't want to do that anymore. But when I was a young man, like teenager and stuff, I wanted to do this. And so, well, how did that work? Well, let's say you're going to be a comic book writer or artist. What inspired you to do that was you were a comic book fan to begin with. So in the first place, you were a fan and a consumer of the product. You were a user of the product, right? This is the equivalent of somebody who plays video games like this becoming a game creator, right? So you got into the creative part of the field by first loving the item, the thing, and admiring the great people who did it and wanting to be like them. If you're an artist, you wanted to be like George Perez or John Byrne or Walt Simonson or one of those type, Sal Buscema, one of the artists, whoever it was that inspired you when you were young to want to draw superheroes and comic books, right? And then what would happen is if you really wanted to do this, in the old days, this doesn't work anymore. They don't do this anymore in comics. But in the old days, what would happen is each comic book, of course, had an editor. They still do that. Each comic book had an editor, and the editor would decide who was going to write and draw and so on and so forth. And if you had an interest in being, say, a comic book writer and you liked Batman, the way you broke into the industry was that you wrote a Batman single issue script, right? And you addressed a letter and cover letter and the script to the editor of Batman. And here is a story, one issue story of Batman, right? And you had to do your best to make it so that the story could kind of happen at any time. You weren't supposed to give any clues as to like when in the timeline of Batman it could happen. Because what they would do is if they liked it, they'd pay you for it. And then they would keep it in the file, in their filing cabinet. And if they got to a point where the writer of Batman couldn't get his script done in time, they would pull your script out and they would get somebody to draw the art and they would publish it. These were called inventory stories. And usually they would assign the inventory story to an artist who they had some sample pages of, but wasn't working for the company, right? And so an inventory story was often done by writers you never heard of, artists you never heard of. And I used to see this and like I didn't used to know where like why they would do this. You're in the middle of a story, Batman's a four-part story. You've got part 1, you've got part 2. And then between part 3 and 4 there's a single issue standalone and there's a little asterisk and it says this story takes place before the events of the last 3 issues, right? So before this story arc, because the writer who submitted the inventory story a year ago couldn't have known anything about this story arc, right? And so if they used your inventory stories a couple times and they got to see that it was successful, they got good feedback from the letter writers that they liked your stories, eventually the editor would hire you as an artist if they liked your art, or as the writer if they liked your stories, to be a writer of a comic book. It might not be Batman. You might get hired to write Catwoman, or you might get hired to write Superman or something like that. But they would then hire you to write a story. And if you did well enough, you would go from being like a freelancer to being a writer who was sort of on staff, right? I think they pretty much always paid you by the story, and they rarely, I don't think, salaried these people because the comic companies were pretty cheap, and comics weren't a lucrative business. But you could get steady work if you were somebody like Walt Simonson or George Perez or Marv Wolfman, who had shown a history of being a good writer and had developed a fan base that they thought you could, bring along with you. So when Peter David was approached by DC Comics to switch from Marvel to DC after becoming famous for the Hulk, right? And he then said, I want to do Supergirl. They let him do it because they figured he had a built-in audience of people who would come with him and read the comic just because he was doing it. So even though Supergirl had never been a very popular character and her comic books had never really sold very well, they were willing to give it a try, and it actually sold pretty well for a few years. So now you're the writer, right? You're Peter David, or you're uh, Paul Levitz, and you're the writer of this comic book and maybe several comic books. And now you've worked in the industry for 10 years. And you've written X-Men, and you've written Batman, and you've written Captain America, and so on. And now Marvel Comics or DC Comics is looking for an assistant editor. And they pick you because you have experience. You know how the writing process works. You know how the publication process works for comics. You know about deadlines and how to meet them and all the rest of it. So you're experienced in the industry. You also were a fan, so you know what the fans want. So you have this situation where, oh darn it, I taunted that guy because I thought I might get hit by somebody from above, and I stood here too long, and he saw me anyway. So now I'm getting pounded by everybody. Over aggroed. Like, I clocked it just too late. So now you are an assistant editor. Then you might become an editor, right? And so little by little, piece by piece, you advance in the company from the ranks of the editors, who came from the ranks of the assistant editors, who came from the ranks of the writers and the artists, who came from the ranks of the fans and the consumers of the product. They get an editor-in-chief who sets the direction of the company, and they get a publisher and a vice president. Paul Levitz, who was a writer of the Legion of Superheroes for years and then became an editor, was also the vice president of DC Comics, right? A guy who was a writer, who had been a fan, who had been an editor. And so what this particular publisher was saying, that this person on BookTube was saying, is that in the past, the people who were running the companies that produced the work of the creative folks, right? Those people had been creatives themselves, and so they understood the creative process, and they understood what the fans wanted and all the rest of it, right? But what's been happening recently is that the people who are being put in charge of these companies that are putting out the products that were designed by creative people, the presidents and the publishers and the editors in chief, are no longer former creatives themselves. They come from a big tech company or something, right? They were a big executive at Microsoft responsible for getting everybody to buy Microsoft Word, and now they're put in charge of something like Dungeons and Dragons, and they don't know anything about Dungeons and Dragons. This literally happened, right? What's her name, Cynthia Williams, who just resigned, by the way, from Wizards of the Coast, or was asked to leave, or was fired. We don't know. She just left Wizards of the Coast after 2 years. Admitted in an interview that she had never played a hand of Magic the Gathering. She ran Wizards of the Coast and had never played a hand of Magic the Gathering, which is their flagship card game, or a session of Dungeons and Dragons. So she doesn't know anything about playing those games. But additionally, it's her job to greenlight adventures, and she's never written an adventure. It's her to greenlight content books like a Monster Manual, and she's never made a stat block. It's her job to greenlight Magic the Gathering packs of cards, and she's never played it, but she's also never sat down and designed her own card. Not even talking about designing it for actual publication, but lots of people for fun will sit down and just kind of design their own Magic cards and play with them just within their game groups, right? And so she's never done that creative work. So how do you figure out what the creative direction of the company should be, and which created things, which bits of content that the creators are putting out are the bits of content that people are going to want and that are going to work well? They have no clue. And what this person apparently was saying, this person who used to be an editor at a publishing house, was saying, is this is why you're seeing a lot of recycled content, because the level of knowledge they have about the creative process is marketing research level, right? It's not, they've never written a novel. They have no idea how to do it, right? So all they can do is say, well, Game of Thrones sold a lot, let's publish another book like Game of Thrones, right? A Court of Thorns and Roses, this romantasy genre, sells a lot, let's just publish more romantasy. And whether it's any good or not doesn't matter, because they can't tell if it's any good. They don't read these books. They're not fans of fantasy or romance or romantasy, right? They're just publishing what works. Cynthia Williams greenlit projects based on what some marketing research told her had been successful in the past, I would guess, and therefore would be successful again in the future. Right? She presumably greenlit the OGL scandal that happened, right? She was listening to lawyers. And my guess is the people at the company who are the creatives and don't have any control over anything were probably, my understanding is they were screaming and yelling at the execs, don't do this. Don't revoke the OGL. It's incredibly important to the community. But because these people don't try to run D&D adventures or write their own, they've never written their own third-party adventure and publish it on the DM's Guild or anything like that, they have no clue. And so they're relying on information that's like coming out of a spreadsheet. And so what this person was saying about publishing, but I think it's true for games, I think it's true for comics, TV, movies, video games, role-playing, board games, is the people making the decisions don't know anything about the creative process, and therefore they're making terrible decisions about what to put out. And that's why you get a lot of repetitive content. You get a lot of terrible movies and TV. You ever watch a movie? I've done it before in recent years. You're watching a movie and going, who the heck thought this was any good? How could anyone associated with this project have thought this was any good? Who the heck would greenlight this script? Who would sign on to do this project? Right? Like, didn't anybody stop and say this is stupid? Right? Unfortunately, we know of cases, right? With The Last Jedi, Mark Hamill twice or 3 times told them, this is stupid. This is not the Luke Skywalker I'm used to. I'm not used to putting myself in this mindset when I play this character. And he was told he doesn't understand Luke Skywalker. Right? Now, that was the director, but the whole thing was green-lit by people who don't know anything about the creative process. And so you're sitting there watching this movie or a TV show, or you're reading a game, a video, or you're playing a video game, you're like, who the heck allowed this to get, like, how did this ever get published? Now, there's been bad stuff throughout history, of course, right? But it seems like it's happening a lot now. And what we're seeing is billion-dollar endeavors going straight down the drain. Somebody was saying, I was watching that video games now, and I guess I really lowballed it, some of these AAA titles, they when you include the market, these are like movies, like big movies in the budget. I can't remember which game it was. It was over 300,000. It was closing in on $400 million to produce the game, and $550 million on marketing and promotion. They spent $1 billion on whatever this game was, and it tanked. And the company lost hundreds of millions of dollars on it. I can't remember which AAA title it was. But the whole idea that you'd spend $1 billion on this thing that's junk, and it's like and it seems like, you're like, can't the people running this company see that this is junk? Why did they, that this isn't worth spending $1 billion on? No, they can't, because they're bean counters, they're number crunchers. They came from outside of the industry because they were good at, making some Fortune 500 company gain stock, right? And the stock price went up, and so their portfolio is, if you hire me as your CEO, I'll double the stock prices and all the investors will be happy, right? But they're producing games that are terrible. It's happening in comic books, it's happening in movies, it's happening in television, all over the place. And so this person was talking about publishing, but the publisher, the guy who's formerly worked for a publishing house, was saying, it happening all over the place. And this dovetails with the video that I made with American Truck Simulator. Dan Didio was saying this about comic books, right? It's the same thing. The people running the industry don't know anything about comic books. They've never collected comic books. They probably never spent 5 minutes in a comic book shop. They've never been a part of the comic book reading culture. They were hired from the outside because they worked at a tech company and made billions at the tech company, and so Warner Brothers thinks they'll make billions for DC Comics, and they come in and they make these decisions having to do with characters, beloved characters that people have been reading for 30 years, and they make these dumb decisions about the characters that ruin the character for everybody who loves the character, because they think it'll work for marketing. For this month, we'll sell more comics, right? But long term, people are going to hate this, and you're going to stop selling comics, and they're not going to trust you anymore. And these guys don't get it because they don't have comic books in their house with acid-free backing boards and Mylar, sheaths, right? Mylar bags. They don't have tracking software to track a checklist of, which comics. I remember they used to have, I don't know if they have these anymore. I don't have them. But, you store comics in these long boxes of cardboard. By the way, you can get acid-free long boxes too, although if your comics are in Mylars, I don't see why you would need that, but you can. And they have dividers. And I remember the dividers that I had, right, they have a little tongue on them the way like a folder would. But then on the actual body of the divider itself, which is just a little bit larger than a comic book, there's a checklist that goes from number 1 to number 400 with little empty boxes on it, so that you could check off which ones you have, right? This is the collecting of the hobby. And I remember I was reading I was Batman or Superman at the time that was over number 400, and I actually went through the idiot process of taking one of the dividers to the library where I worked in high school, Xeroxing it, whiting out all of the leading numbers and starting them at number 401 instead of number 1 and going all the way up to like 800 because Superman was on like number 600 or something. And then this way I could check them off, right? Again, this is not something that the people who work at DC Comics and run DC Comics, the writers did this. The people still involved in the industry at the creative level did this. But the people calling the shots and running things, the vice president and the president and stuff, they never did this. Because they weren't hired because of their love of comics or because they used to be comic book writers or artists or colorists or letterers. They were hired because they made some company on the Fortune 500 go from number 500 to number 478 on the Fortune 500, and DC wants to go up a couple of notches. And they think that under this person's leadership, we will. And I went through the wrong elevator. Did I not? Yes, I did. It's on the other side. I'm talking too much. So yeah, and this is what's been happening, and I think it's a really it's something that is crossing disciplines and creative endeavors, publishing, television and entertainment, music, movies, all of it is being affected by putting people in charge who are not creatives. They've never been part of the process of making something like a video game and figuring out how to do it, right? And as a consequence, they just don't know. They don't know what to green light or not green light. Ugh, this guy. He's got me at 8%. It's not even worth putting one of these on because it's only going to put me up to 40%. And I can't. Can I change targets yet, or does he still have me taunted? Okay, he taunted me, but maybe his thing went over. Okay, yeah, it wore out. His little defense. So yeah, I've talked about how things are aren't a labor of love anymore. I think they're a labor of love for the people on the ground. The guy who's actually drawing the comic book, and the penciler, the inker, the letterer. Yeah, they still love what they're doing, to the degree that the company will let them love it. But we have seen over and over again where the creative people have been hamstrung by the very business owners that run the company. I remember Gail Simone wrote Batgirl in the New 52 when the New 52 came out, 2011-12. She wrote Batgirl for about 35 issues or something. I don't know, for a while, 2 or 3 years, and she kept. And Batgirl was very depressing kind of a comic, right? It always went from bad to worse for Batgirl. It was a very sort of gloomy and depressing comic to read. It was beautifully drawn for a long number of issues, and it was the stories were good, but it was just very dark and gloomy. And after she was let go, because of differences with the editor, she said that she kept asking them to let her ease up on Barbara Gordon, right? That she had her writer's instinct told her that although yes, you want to kill your darlings and you always want to make things hard on the characters, the readers need a break every so many issues, right? This isn't a novel where they're just going to read it for a month and it's done. They're reading this thing every month for years, and every month it gets more and more depressing for Barbara, and they like Barbara and they don't want it to be depressing for her. And so she said, you got to let me do some happier stories. Let me give her a boyfriend and let the relationship work out or something. And they steadfastly refused to allow her to lighten it up, right? So this is a writer who's a creative person who is, look at this, even with build-up going up 8% chance. That's the floor. He's got me floored. It's ridiculous that a single power can floor me when I have 90% base. And now I can't even hit a guy with 70% to hit. And so, yeah, this is what happens, right? The people who are in charge of the company are telling the creative people to do stuff that the creative people don't want to do, but they have no choice. right? And after she argued with the editor enough, he fired her and hired another writer. And the other writer was like, "Yeah, I'm going to make this a little less gloomy and more cheerful." Gail Simone was right, which really irritated me, right? Now, since then, I haven't really liked anything Gail Simone's done since, I'll be honest. I was ambivalent at best over her Red Sonja run. I didn't think it was very good compared to other Red Sonja arcs I've seen. I think Amy Chu actually did one of the best ones, and Michael Oeming did a really good one. But yeah, the point is that even when the creative people like Mark Hamill are telling you what you're doing doesn't work, they're not always listened to, and the bosses are making really bad calls. And this is several different people now, right? Dan Didio, who used to run DC Comics, and this other person whose name I don't know, he worked for like Random House or something, right? One of the big publishing houses, saying that the problem we have is that we have people in charge of these industries that are responsible for producing creative work, right? Who've never done any creative work themselves, and they don't have any idea how to do it. They don't have any idea what makes a good story because they've never written a story. They don't have any idea what makes a good pack of magic cards because they've never made a magic card. They don't have any idea what's a good dungeon because they've never made up a dungeon. But they're the ones deciding what gets published and what gets put out. And they're making bad decisions because they have no idea what's any good. And I thought that was a really interesting comment, and I think it's probably true. It definitely was true with Wizards of the Coast, right? They've made bad decision after bad decision, probably made by Cynthia Williams, and those bad decisions, like, what shocked me was the arrogance. And I didn't read the actual article, all right, so don't quote me on this, and I might be mistaken, because I only know what I saw someone on a YouTube video saying about the article. I didn't read it myself. My understanding is that she was asked, "Have you ever played D&D or Magic?" And she said no. And then she was asked, "Do you ever intend to play them?" And she said either no or probably not. Right? Like, she didn't seem to feel the need to play her own game, her own product, in order to run the company that produces those games. Like, aren't you at least curious? You're selling hundreds of millions of dollars of cardboard with weird art on it in little bits of thin cardboard. You're making millions on it. Aren't you curious why everybody's spending all this money on these things? Not even a little bit? On what the hype is of your own company? Nope. She had no interest, as I understand it. And I don't believe she ever learned to play D&D or Magic. As far as I know, it never happened. Right? You're in the company for 2 years and you never once sampled its product? I mean, that's like owning a restaurant and never eating the food to find out if it's any good. Like, I don't know. But it definitely explains why so many bad decisions were made, because the company is being run by people who've never consumed the product and never done any of the creative work. So they're telling the creative people to do stuff that the creative people know isn't going to work, but there's nothing they can do. So they got to make the best of it. Right? And the people who are creatives who used to be fans know the fans are going to hate this, but we got to make the best of it. And that's how you get the OGL scandal. Right? That there were people, I think it was Steve Glicker, who knows a bunch of industry insiders, said there were people in the room when they were deciding to do this, begging them, practically screaming at them, "Don't do this. You're going to unnecessarily tick off the fan base." The people who use the third-party products, they're not going to just go quietly into the night. They're going to get mad. They're going to complain. And that's exactly what happened. Right? But if you've never played the game and you don't understand the fan base, you have no basis for comparison, and you just don't understand the gamers, right? I mean, gamers, one thing I will say about gamers is, boy, they know how to kick up a firestorm over something that they think is unjust or uncalled for or whatever. Um, what game was it? There was a game recently where they got into all these ridiculous microtransactions, and the fans just kicked up an absolute uproar over it, and the company backed off, which just shot me, right? And they made an apology. City Skylines, by the way, put out by Paradox, but I don't. But it was Colossal Order or whatever the name of the studio that makes City Skylines that had to put out they put out an apology, right? They put out a buggy game that had a lot of problems, and then they put out an expansion pack or whatever right after too soon after the game was launched, and that had some problems too. And they issued an apology, and they basically gave I think, don't quote me on this, but I think, because I watched a video about this, but it was like a month ago. They issued an apology, and they gave everybody a refund on the expansion pack, I think, or gave it to everybody for free. And they said if you bought it, we'll refund you or something like that. I can't remember how they did it, but like they said we're sorry, you know. Why'd they have to apologize like that? Because the gamers went nuts and said this is not right. So gamers can be extremely vocal. They could be extremely harsh. I remember, like, I have absolutely laughed at the guys who run the Dungeons and Dragons Beyond, the D&D Beyond forums, the moderators. They're constantly going and moderating. And I mean, I did the mildest little thing, and they said, "Oh, it's flaming," and they gave me this little 5-point, whatever you want to call it, infraction. It didn't do anything. There was no, like, I wasn't suspended or banned or anything like that. You get suspended after you get too many points, but I wasn't. I'm not there. I wasn't anywhere near that. I stopped posting after that because I said I'm not going to post if they're going to, because what I did was totally innocuous by normal gaming forum standards. But it's clear that the people who were moderating it have no idea how really rough a game forum can be. What I did was nothing compared to what I've seen on gaming forums and had posted in response to my post. I mean, I've been flamed. Gamers can be really rough, and I think some of these folks don't realize it, and they get on the wrong end of the stick, and yeah, it can be ugly. But all of this is happening because the people running these companies are bean counters and corporate, business folks, and they're not creatives, they're not designers, they're not the people who make the stuff. And I've over-aggroed again. Go ahead and go grab Hasten. I don't know if anybody's hitting me with ice, but just in case, because sometimes they do. Yep. Does he got? No, he's doing it. Nice. This is a heck of a spawn here. That's actually a couple of spawns. Because one of them was probably protecting the... well, no, I guess none of them were protecting. So there were 3 spawns in here. The hostage, the boss's spawn, and then this other spawn with the lieutenant. And what saved me is dizzying them. Say, what do you guys think? Are there other industries I haven't mentioned where the same thing is going on? I mean, I know this is sort of an age-old problem, right? That just because George Perez was a great artist and drew amazing art doesn't mean he would make a good editor. And just because he's a good editor doesn't mean he'd make a good president of a company, right? Where you have to actually take care of your employees and negotiate with the workers' union and stuff like that. It's a totally different skill set from somebody who was an artist, right? George Perez went to art school. He didn't go to business school. But there is a subset of creative people who would be skilled at doing that, and you can train them. You could always send George Perez to get his MBA, right? And if he wants to do it, he can learn it. And then you have somebody with an MBA who also understands the creative process. But the way they're doing it right now, I don't know. It certainly doesn't seem to be succeeding at all. Tell me what you guys think. I'd be interested to hear it. Okay, I think that's enough for tonight. We're going to stop here. Until next time, folks, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been City of Heroes.